The air was dense, thick with the metallic scent of the detention block synsteel and the low, insistent thrum of the dampening field. It pressed down on Aryan Talus like a physical weight, heavier than any gravitational surge he'd ever navigated. His hands, cuffed in heavy, cold plasteel, still held the residual tremor of the event. Not fear, but the ghost of quantum vibration, a phantom echo of time that didn't belong to him anymore. The Council's prosecutorial projection shimmered into existence near the ceiling. It was a cold, blue light, shifting without a face, utterly devoid of mercy. Talus did not lift his gaze. He kept his eyes fixed on the cuffs, watching the faint reflection of the sterile light wobble across the polished metal. He was a Level 4 navigational architect, a title earned through exhaustive, obsessive mastery of nonlinear mechanics, and yet the only thing he felt now was the bitter failure of his greatest asset, his self-belief. His calculations had been perfect. His timing, down to the picosecond, had been immaculate. He had stabilized the accretion disk pull. He had saved the Icarus. He had saved 300 souls. But calculation and consequence were two vastly different systems. The projection began, its voice synthesized to a monotonous baritone that erased all inflection. Architect Talus, you stand charged with 300 counts of temporal sabotage and 1 count of gross violation of the covenant of chronological integrity. Binti. Talus mentally recited the 27 seconds, the emergency klaxons screaming, the hull groaning under forces that shouldn't exist outside a black hole event, the metallic, slightly burnt smell of overworked reactor cores, the frantic, almost silent prayer on Captain Alara Kane's face as she stared across the console at him, waiting for the impossibility he was about to deliver. Your primary defense, as submitted in your preliminary logs, is that the localized dilation bubble was the only viable method to prevent total hull catastrophic failure. That claim is not under review. The voice paused, a silence heavy enough to make Talus's ears pop. We are not debating survival, Architect. We are quantifying the debt. The true cost of the operation hit him then, a cold realization that made his chest ache under the thin synth uniform of the detention center. The prosecution wasn't concerned with the dead. They were concerned with the balance sheet. 5 standard years had passed outside the bubble for the 3 days his crew spent patching the Icarus back together. 5 years of lost sector trade routes. 5 years of optimized mining yields missed. 5 years of geopolitical agreements that shifted the balance of power, leaving the returning Icarus Cruise Corporation significantly diminished. They hadn't saved the ship. They had bankrupted a sector timeline. He remembered the final gut-wrenching moment inside the bridge of the Icarus, just before the temporal barriers collapsed and launched them back into real time. He had looked at Captain Kane, her face covered in sweat and grease, a genuine raw smile of victory on her lips. "We did it, Talus," she had gasped, her voice raw, and he had felt the first sharp sting of dread. "Yes, Captain, we did it now. The question is, what future did we land in?" Log records indicate that crew pilot Kellen Reese's wife had relocated to Port Moran after declaring him legally deceased 2 years prior to their return. Captain Kane's eldest daughter, who was 7 at departure, is now a teenager she has never met. The voice didn't sound accusatory, merely factual, listing the collateral damage as if it were damaged cargo. The trauma of returning to an orphaned future exceeds the initial trauma of the near-fatal event, Architect. You rescued them, then you alienated them. Talus looked up finally, straight into the flickering blue light. That was the core of it. He hadn't just sacrificed time. He had fractured 300 personal histories. He had brought them home to a world that was utterly strange to them, where they were ghosts of a past that had already moved on. The heroes were now the aliens. The cold on his hands intensified, not from the plasteel, but from a sudden, dizzying drop in his internal temperature. It was shame, a colder metal than the cuffs themselves. He had whispered to the machinery, "I save them now, and argue later." But there was no argument possible for what he had done to Kellen Reese's children. He had given them back their father, but stripped them of 5 years of memory, closeness, and evolution. They looked at Reese now with the wary, confused gaze reserved for strangers who used to wear familiar faces. He knew that the crew, who had hailed him as a god inside the bubble, now viewed him with a quiet, sickening resentment, not because he had broken the law, but because he had broken their lives. We calculate the cumulative temporal debt at 5.1 standard years, representing 73,459,872 operational hours of lost productivity, and an unquantifiable erosion of faith in the stability of the sector's regulatory physics. The projection droned on. Tallis leaned forward slightly. And what about the 300 lives saved? Does that equate to 0 operational hours? The projection did not shift or change tone. The covenant dictates that the stability of history outweighs the survival of any single entity, architect. You substituted your own judgment for established galactic law. You imposed a temporal distortion that was not sanctioned. You dictated time itself. He closed his eyes, remembering the moment of transition, the terrible, dizzying shift as the dilation bubble collapsed. The sound had been like tearing silk, the fundamental noise of reality ripping apart, a sound only Tallis seemed to recognize fully. He was a navigational architect, yes, trained at the prestigious Synthera Academy, but that was the veneer. The truth was harder, colder, buried deep under compliance logs and certification papers. The reason he didn't flinch when he bypassed the safeties wasn't arrogance, it was a deep inherited certainty. He didn't just calculate temporal dynamics, he had a frighteningly intimate relationship with them. He knew where the lines bent because he had spent his life walking right up to the edge. He opened his eyes and studied the projection. This council, sitting in judgment perhaps thousands of kilometers away, cared nothing for the terror of the accretion disk. They were bureaucrats armed with physics, policing the edge of the known universe with ledgers and rules. He felt the cold returning, the familiar icy dread of discovery. He hadn't just broken the law, he had revealed a capability that scared them more than any economic debt. The fact that he could, without hesitation, manipulate time on a localized scale suggested training and resources far beyond a mere architect's pay grade. The only sound in the cell was the thrumming, dampening field and the voice of the projection. For this violation, the Council has determined that your expertise represents a clear and present danger to chronological stability. The sentence is total temporal incarceration, effective immediately. You will be stripped of all certifications, and your consciousness archived in a non-temporal holding matrix for a period equivalent to the debt you incurred, 5.1 standard years. Tallis didn't react physically. 5 years archived. 5 years of absolute internal silence while the external universe moved on, leaving him, the expert on time, truly orphaned in stasis. But the Council had miscalculated one thing. They thought this was a punishment. For Tallis, who had just spent 3 days watching the crew he loved wrestle with the existential terror of a slow-motion catastrophe, 5 years of complete silence was starting to sound dangerously like a cure. He lifted his cuffed hands just slightly, enough to catch the light. The faint quantum vibration was still there, a buzz deep in the bones. The Council had confiscated his logs, his ship data, and his freedom. But they hadn't confiscated his mind. And they certainly hadn't confiscated the memory of what he saw when he tore the fabric of time. "Do you have any final statement, Architect Tallis?" the projection asked, completing its dry recitation of the sentence. Tallis leaned back against the cold sin-steel wall. The feeling of the dampening field was like being encased in lead. He looked at the flickering blue light, not with regret for the law he broke, but with a terrible, growing realization that the cost of the temporal distortion hadn't been fully accounted for. The 27 seconds had been calculated perfectly. The 5 years lost outside the bubble were the price of those seconds. But in the violent tearing of reality necessary to create the dilation bubble, Tallis had momentarily glimpsed outside the timeline. He had seen something vast and cold moving through the static of history. He spoke, his voice hoarse from disuse, cutting through the sterile silence of the cell. "The debt is not 50 million hours," Tallis murmured, his eyes wide, fixed on a point far past the ceiling. "The debt is the thing I brought back with us." His face, normally controlled, was etched with sudden, genuine terror. The truth hit him. He hadn't just alienated the crew from their pasts. By bypassing the chronological safeties, he had opened a door, and the Icarus hadn't returned alone. The prosecution had focused on the loss of 5 years. Talus was terrified of what those 5 years had cost in protection. "You can archive my consciousness," he whispered, cold sweat beading on his forehead. "But you can't archive the breach." The synthesized voice repeated, confused. "Architect, your statement is non-compliant with the established parameters." Talus ignored it. He felt the phantom vibration intensify, a deep, bone-jarring rattle. It wasn't the quantum leap. It was something else, responding to the low hum of the dampening field. He realized the true weight of the plasteel chains. The council wasn't locking him away for breaking time, but for the unforgivable sin of seeing what was waiting on the other side. And whatever it was still trying to follow the crew home. The projection blinked out, leaving behind only the echoing hum of the dampening field. It was the sound of complete authority, a constant low pressure that physically restricted movement and thought. Talus didn't get his 5 years of silence. The chamber door hissed open immediately, releasing a gust of air that carried the faint, bitter scent of burnt electrical components, a familiar aroma that made the hair on Talus's arms stand up. 3 enforcement drones, heavily shielded and moving with the programmed efficiency of a swarm, entered the detention space. They didn't speak. Their mandate was simple: secure the asset. Initiate the transfer. Talus, still shackled, stood slowly. The plasteel cuffs felt suddenly heavier, colder, the very metal seeming to drain his internal heat. He needed to communicate the severity of the thing he sensed, but how could he convey an existential threat, a glimpse of cold, vast motion outside the timeline, to 3 machines designed only to uphold statutes? "Listen to me," Talus said, his voice surprisingly steady, considering the seismic terror in his chest. The temporal field, the bubble, it created an instability, not just chronologically but dimensionally. You are locking away the only person who can quantify the contamination. The lead drone extended a manipulator arm, its metallic fingers unfolding with clinical indifference, ignoring his words. The council was predictable. Any mention of unauthorized observation or non-compliant reality structures was immediately labeled quantum stress psychosis, a common diagnosis among those who pushed the limits of chronal mechanics. As the drone gripped his arm, Talus felt a spike in the phantom vibration, a deep, bone-jarring rattle that seemed to resonate with the drone's energy field. The sensation was concentrated, sharp, like cold static centered in his wrist. He recognized the signature, a residual temporal signature seeking a conductive energy source. The drone was acting as an unwitting antenna. "The dampening field isn't containing it, it's attracting it," Talus gritted out, pulling his arm back slightly. The drone applied precisely 7 kilograms of pressure, enforcing compliance. It was an argument not worth having. Talus allowed himself to be moved, saving his energy for the archival chamber itself. That was where the real threat lay. The archival matrix was a colossal, localized energy sink, designed to hold consciousness outside the flow of time. If the thing was looking for a door, the matrix was a beacon. The journey was short, down a sterile corridor of white sin steel that reflected the blue emergency lights in cold geometric patterns. His mind, the machine that had just calculated 3 days of crisis into 27 seconds, raced. He needed to override the archival sequence and turn the stasis into an observational post. He entered the chamber. It was dominated by the matrix chair, a high-backed throne of carbonite riddled with needle-fine neural injection ports. The air in here was different, carrying the metallic, sterile scent of ozone and the faint, unsettling sweetness of the stasis serum. As the drones forced him into the seat, Talus briefly closed his eyes. This wasn't just about survival. This was about atonement. He had always believed in bending the rules for the greater good, the ultimate utility calculus. His father, a logistics captain, had died upholding the immutable laws of transit during the Great Sector Famine, refusing to bypass security protocols even when 3,000 colonists starved slowly. Tallis had carried that shame like lead. His father died a law-abiding man, and his failure was measured in the lives lost to compliance. Obedience is the highest form of negligence, he had thought then, when the cost is human. This belief was why he'd bypassed the chronal safeties of the Icarus without blinking. He traded 5 years of stability for 300 heartbeats. Now, facing the cold steel of the archival matrix, he knew the law was claiming its debt, not just for the temporal violation, but for his unforgivable moral independence. A new projection materialized, not the generic blue of the prosecution, but a sharper, three-dimensional construct of a woman. Regulator Vanya Sorel. She was angular, precise, dressed in the dark grays of the authority's highest governance. She looked less like a bureaucrat and more like a predator who had mastered geometry. Architect Tallis, I am Regulator Sorel, head of the Chronological Integrity Committee. Your final plea regarding the breach has been logged and analyzed. It is catalogued as a standard hallucination sequence caused by dilation stress. We are proceeding. Her voice was tight, high, every syllable measured. She did not argue. She decreed. Regulator Sorel, I have saved the lives of your captain and crew. I risked myself to preserve the integrity of the Icarus. I am telling you, what followed us back did not respect the dilation bubble. It breached the integrity of the quantum shield and is now latent in the sector. Sorel tilted her head, a movement so slight it was more dismissive than curious. The only breach that concerns the authority is the one you created, Architect. You place the survival of 300 individuals above the stability of historical continuity. That is an act of temporal terrorism, regardless of outcome. She was the perfect antagonist, not evil, but absolutely rigid. She saw the universe as a delicate clockwork mechanism, and Tallis as the rogue gear that jammed the machine, never mind that the machine was about to crush itself. The archival restraints clamped down on his shoulders and chest. Tallis felt the sharp prick of the neural injectors on his neck and temples. This is the moment, he thought. The stasis serum was designed to instantly arrest neural activity, turning his vibrant, calculating mind into a static ledger entry for 5.1 years. He concentrated intensely, ignoring the mounting pressure, focusing on the slight tremor in his cuffed hands. That vibration, that ghost echo, was the key. It was a faint bridge back to the moment of the tear. As the first cold rush of the stasis serum hit his bloodstream, causing a dizzying drop in temperature and blurring his vision, Tallis forced his mind to run the bypass sequence. He didn't have time for a full hack. He needed a simple subroutine, a ghost loop, to keep his auditory cortex minimally active, listening to the static, listening for the frequency of the thing he brought back. He forced a neural surge through the residual quantum vibration in his cuffs, using the external drone's energy field to piggyback a burst of data. It was clumsy, painful, a self-inflicted neural feedback loop designed to look like a standard system failure. A sharp electric shock convulsed through his body, arching his back against the carbonite chair. His mouth opened in a silent gasp. The pain was blinding, but it created the necessary glitch. The stasis serum halted its full injection momentarily, buying him half a second. The regulator Sorel projection frowned, a rare flicker of emotion. System irregularity detected. QSP feedback spike. Increase stasis dose by 20%. Too late, regulator. Tallis thought triumphantly, though his victory tasted like bile and burnt synapses. He had managed to install a rudimentary auditory filter, locking onto the unique temporal frequency of the breach echo. He would be paralyzed, unable to move or think coherently, a digital statue. But his ears would still be ringing in the dark, 5 years of listening for the sound that tore reality. The full dose of stasis serum hit him like a physical blow, a sudden crushing darkness that extinguished thought and sensation. The last thing he felt was the terrifying, exquisite cessation of time. But the auditory filter held. Instead of silence, Tallis was plunged into a roaring ocean of static. 5 years of pure white noise, but filtered within that noise was the specific, high-pitched whine of the breach echo, and the echo was getting closer. He was trapped in the non-temporal holding matrix, a prisoner of silence and stasis, but his awareness, a tiny needle point in the black, was screaming. He couldn't move, couldn't react, couldn't signal. He was deaf and blind, yet forced to listen. Days, weeks, months blurred in the void. Time was meaningless here, yet Talus's internal clock, honed by years of navigational mastery, tracked the steady progression of the external debt. 1 year gone, 2 years, 3. The white noise was constant, but Talus began to distinguish patterns in the echo's whine. It wasn't random static. It was structured, searching. The horrifying revelation came during the supposed end of Year 4. The echo was not just following the Icarus crew. It was focused. It wasn't trying to breach the system. It was trying to communicate through the residual temporal signatures left on the people Talus had saved. The crew had become involuntary conduits, walking anomalies in the established timeline. And then Talus realized the deepest horror of his hack. He had turned the archival matrix, the most secure, time-dampened location in the sector, into a perfect receiver. He was amplifying the signal. The echo's pattern changed. It became a rhythm, a desperate, rapid sequence of clicks and sharp, agonizing bursts. It wasn't trying to hurt the crew. It was feeding on their trauma, specifically the trauma of temporal displacement. The crew member who resented Talus the most, the one who had lost the most, would be the strongest beacon. Kellen Reese. The pilot whose wife had remarried, whose children were strangers. Suddenly, through the static, Talus's limited awareness detected a specific, painful pulse. It was the chronal signature of Reese, now localized, strong, and highly irregular. Reese was somewhere on the authorities' central hub, highly agitated, acting as a massive energy drain. The breach echo wasn't a monster. It was a hungry entity seeking sustenance, and Reese's fractured personal timeline was a 5-year feast. Then, through the deafening white noise of the matrix, the echo sharpened, piercing the static. It was no longer a whine. It was a single, clear thought, alien and cold, echoing through Talus's paralyzed mind. We are now aligned. Talus felt the pressure in his skull double. The external universe was shifting. 5 years was almost up, but the entity had found its pathway into reality, and it had used the crew, his heroes, to do it. Just as the timer for the archival matrix counted down its final minute, initiating the flush sequence designed to bring Talus's consciousness back online, the filtered auditory loop delivered one final devastating piece of information. The cold, searching presence of the breach echo was no longer focused on Reese. It was focused on the source of the archival matrix itself. It wasn't trying to follow the crew home. It was using the crew to locate the authorities' central time repository, the very regulatory system Sorel was sworn to protect. Talus realized with sickening certainty that the Council's decision to lock him away had not preserved chronological integrity. It had inadvertently invited the Predator to dinner. A sudden, sharp burst of feedback tore through his neural filter. It was not the echo's frequency. It was a security alert, raw and uncontrolled. Chronological integrity breach, Sector 4 main archive. Unauthorized temporal surge detected. Initiate lockdown. Code, Icarus. The authority was under attack, and Talus, the navigational architect who dictated time, was trapped in the cold matrix, the only mind who understood the enemy, now rushing toward conscious reinstatement in the very epicenter of the crisis. The flush sequence, designed to smoothly reintroduce Talus's consciousness to the flow of time, was anything but smooth. It felt less like an awakening, and more like being struck by a colossal electromagnetic pulse. The cessation of the deep black void was instantaneous, replaced by a searing pain behind his eyes and the booming chaos of the external world. He was back online, but his physical senses lagged. His vision was a shifting canvas of red and blue emergency strobes, filtered through the thick, acidic tears that the stasis flush provoked. The noise was overwhelming. Klaxons blaring, code Icarus, the crackle of overstressed conductors, and the rapid, rhythmic thudding of something large and moving down the corridor outside the archival chamber. Talus, still strapped to the carbonite chair, fought for motor control. His first goal was simple: disable the restraints. The ghost loop he'd installed was designed to create an internal system malfunction upon conscious reinstatement, providing a brief window of override. He forced his trembling hands, still cuffed, to focus their residual quantum vibration. Now. He poured the last of his latent temporal energy into the wrist shackles, intending to fry the local lock circuit. A sharp jolt, more painful than the stasis serum itself, ripped through his arms. The plasteel shackles instantly snapped open, smoke curling briefly from the release mechanisms. Victory tasted metallic and brief. He was free of the cuffs. But the moment he tried to lever himself out of the archival matrix chair, the system fought back with unexpected severity. The archival restraints, which had loosened just enough to release his wrists, immediately clamped back down on his shoulders and chest with renewed crushing force. Regulator Sorrel's projection, now flickering violently, screamed across the room. System integrity failure on primary asset restraints. Activate localized inertial dampening field. Maximum pressure. Talus gasped. The air squeezed from his lungs. His hack hadn't worked fast enough. He hadn't bought freedom. He'd only alerted the system to his intention. The dampening field, a localized gravity well generator, activated instantly around the chair, pressing down on him like 5 atmospheres of water. He was still free of the cuffs, but entirely immobile, crushed by an invisible force. He tried to scream, to warn Sorrel about the breach echo, but the pressure sealed his throat. Obedience is the highest form of negligence. He had saved them, and his payment was to be smothered by the very law they worshipped. Through the dizzying flashes of red light, he saw the archival chamber door buckle, not from physical force, but a temporal ripple. The synsteel warped, vibrating violently inward for a picosecond before snapping back to rigid structure, leaving a visible spiderweb crack. The thing was here, actively assaulting the hub, drawn by the archival matrix's massive energy sink. The pressure on Talus's chest intensified, forcing him back into the carbonite seat. His vision tunneled. Second attempt, he thought, battling the nausea. I need to break the dampening field. He knew the field was controlled by a localized circuit on the back panel of the chair. Reaching it was impossible, but overriding it with a neural spike might be, if he could find a conductive path. He looked around wildly, seeking anything external that could act as a bridge. A nearby enforcement drone, still standing guard, was caught in a temporal loop created by the breach echo. Its metallic arm repeated the motion of extending and retracting its manipulator in a stuttering, agonizing millisecond loop. A perfect localized energy source. Talus strained, forcing his head to turn despite the crushing pressure. He needed to touch the drone, even fleetingly, to transfer the pulse and overload the dampening field controls. He pushed his paralyzed legs, his muscles screaming against the inertial dampening. He managed to tilt the chair an inch, then 2. His shoulder hit the carbonite armrest, sending a flash of white-hot pain down his spine. Sorrel's voice projection noticed the movement. Asset is unstable. Prepare for immediate transfer to high-containment stasis cell. Drones, secure the parameter. Talus finally managed to throw his weight, twisting the heavy chair just enough for his foot to scrape the drone's casing. The contact was brief, but it was enough. He sent a pure, untainted surge of quantum feedback into the drone. The drone immediately seized. Instead of malfunctioning, however, its stasis field reversed. The drone didn't collapse. It began to sing. A high, piercing whine that resonated with the frequency of the breach echo Talus had tracked for 5 years in the void. Failure 2, Talus realized, sweat turning instantly cold on his forehead. The attack had evolved. The temporal surge had corrupted the drone's operating system, turning it into a resonant amplifier for the breach echo. The dampening field wasn't containing the threat. It was providing a stage for it. The noise was maddening, a sound that promised the unraveling of reality. The archival chamber door fractured again, the crack deepening. And then, the new element arrived. A single terrified human technician stumbled into the chamber through a service duct near the ceiling, pulling himself out of the passage and dropping hard onto the steel floor. He was wearing a low-level maintenance uniform, identified by the orange strip on his sleeve. His face was white with fear, eyes wide, fixed on the screaming drone and the buckling door. Javen. Tallis recognized instantly. He was the technician who had signed the routine calibration logs just before Tallis's transfer 5 years ago. He was an eyewitness, a survivor, and potentially Tallis's only conduit to the outside. Javen scrambled toward the main control console, ignoring Tallis entirely, driven only by the urgent need to stabilize the screaming systems. He was not an ally, just a victim trying to fix the unfixable. "The dampening field, Tech. Shut down the dampening field. It's feeding the surge," Tallis croaked, fighting the inertia pressing down on his throat. Javen flinched violently, finally noticing the shackled man in the matrix chair. He saw the terror in Tallis's eyes and the crushing pressure field. He didn't see an architect. He saw a desperate man under extreme containment, raving about physics. "Shut up! I need to lock Sector 4, Javen yelled back, his fingers flying across the light panel. As Javen worked, the regulator Sorel projection returned, her features sharp with rage and command. "Technician, do not touch those controls. Asset Tallis is attempting to manipulate you. Engage maximum security override on all primary systems now." Javen froze, caught between the authorities' orders and the screaming warnings of the restrained man. He hesitated, 3 agonizing seconds passing, 3 seconds that cost Tallis his tactical advantage. A sudden, intense pain lanced through Tallis's neural network. The echo, amplified by the drone and anchored by the dampening field, was actively searching, and it found the strongest point of connection. Kellen Reese, the pilot haunted by the lost 5 years. Through the noise and the pain, Tallis felt the echo's singular purpose. It wasn't just feeding on Reese's trauma. It was using Reese's signature to locate the main chronometer, the sector's master clock. Reese was the roadmap. Tallis, driven by the knowledge that Reese was seconds from becoming a temporal bomb, made his desperate choice. He had to save Reese, even if it meant certain capture and destruction for himself. "Reese, Pilot Reese is the key. He's near the chronometer hub. You have to divert power to his sector. Lock him in a localized field now," Tallis forced out, addressing Javen. "You need the manual override sequence for the emergency dampening field. It's only viable way to counter the localized chrono resonance." Javen looked at the screen, his terror now mixed with dawning understanding. He saw the erratic power readings coming from the chronometer hub, matching Tallis's desperate description. He looked at Tallis, seeing not the terrorist, but the expert. "The override. Where is the bypass?" Javen asked, his voice shaking. "Console D7, manual override, use code, Icarus 734E. Tallis rasped, giving away a sequence known only to the 300 crew members, a secret code used during the dilation crisis itself. If Sorel heard it, his identity as a non-compliant hero was cemented. Javen immediately threw himself at console D7. He began punching the command sequence, his hands slippery with cold sweat. The regulator Sorel projection wavered, briefly overwhelmed by the temporal surge, but her voice cut through the static, cold, and final. "Technician Javen, do not comply. That sequence will amplify the chrono resonance by 400%. Tallis is attempting to turn the pilot into a weapon." Javen froze. Amplification. Weapon. The accusation paralyzed him. He was a low-level technician. He couldn't adjudicate complex chronal physics. Which one? Which one is right?" Javen pleaded, tears starting to stream down his face. "She lies!" Tallis screamed, trying to pull against the crushing dampening field. "It's the only way to stabilize the localized field. You have to trust the math." In his panic, Javen didn't input the stabilization sequence. He hit the one button Sorel had warned him about, the one designed to provide absolute systemic defense in case of external chrono attack. Sector isolation, energy amplification. A blast of raw, unfiltered quantum energy surged through the console. Javen didn't even have time to scream. The sheer force of the amplified temporal signature vaporized him instantly. A sharp, burnt metallic scent filled the room, and Javen was gone, leaving only a dark smudge on the floor. The effect on Talus was catastrophic. The energy surge did not fix the problem. It confirmed Sorel's initial statement. The entire sector's chrono-resonance was now amplified and focused, feeding directly through the screaming drone and Talus's shackled body, turning him into a massive, contained temporal conduit. The dampening field, powered by the amplified system, pressed down on Talus with the weight of a dying star. His internal organs screamed. He had tried to save Reese by giving a high-level command to a panicked novice. He had failed spectacularly. Javen was dead, and the threat was exponentially stronger, focused now on the archival matrix, the perfect target. A new voice, low and absolutely commanding, cut through the chaotic alarms on the chamber loudspeaker. It was Sorel's voice, but not the projection. It was live, amplified, close. "Architect Talus," Sorel's voice hissed, devoid of mechanical synthesis, radiating cold satisfaction. "I have secured Pilot Reese. He is in the chronometer core where he belongs. You have conveniently amplified the resonance. The Council's assessment was correct. You are the ideal lure." Talus couldn't move. He couldn't speak. He was an anchor, drowning in lead, watching the archival chamber door finally tear under the sheer stress of the temporal distortion, revealing the blackness of the outside surge. "We required a conductor for the full containment protocol," Sorel concluded, her voice echoing as if she were standing right outside the shattered door. "You will serve your full debt, Architect, not through silence, but as the cage itself." The light in the chamber died, plunging Talus into crushing darkness, alone with the deafening, triumphant roar of the breach echo. He was free of the stasis, but now he was the trap, and the predator had just walked in. The darkness was absolute, heavy, and immediate, but the roaring was far worse than silence. It wasn't a sound, it was an imposition. The breach echo, now fully resonating through the archival matrix, pressed into Talus's confined mind like pure, cold static, drowning out the frantic klaxons and the physical screams of his organs under the dampening field. Talus, crushed against the carbonite, suddenly felt a horrifying shift in the crushing weight. It hadn't decreased, but its nature changed. The dampening field was no longer solely suppressing his movement. It was tuning him, stabilizing his unique temporal signature so that the breach echo could fully connect. In the midst of that deafening static, Talus's mind was forced into contact with the entity that followed them home. It was a contact too vast, too sudden for fear. He saw a flash, not through his eyes but through the quantum signature of the echo itself, a brutal, agonizing vision of the moment the Icarus nearly died. It wasn't an accident. Talus saw the navigational logs of the Icarus 2 hours before the crisis. He saw the cold, perfect hand of a subroutine Talus had never known existed, calculating, optimizing, and then deliberately pushing the Icarus off its stable trajectory, directly into the accretion disk's gravitational anomaly. The near-fatal event was manufactured. The subroutine was labeled Chronal Buffer, Extremis Protocol 77. 3. The realization struck Talus with a force greater than the inertial field. He hadn't been a reckless hero who broke the law. He had been a carefully selected, highly volatile reagent used in a pre-programmed, necessary chemical reaction. He had 27 seconds to save the ship, because Protocol 77-3 had calculated that Talus, and only Talus, possessed the necessary genius and the specific moral flaw, the willingness to sacrifice law for life, to bypass the safeties and create the localized dilation bubble. The 5 lost years were not collateral damage. They were the precise calculated cost required to temporarily tear the timeline in that exact way. The Council didn't charge him for the accident. They charged him for his perfect execution of their hidden self-sacrificial protocol. He saw the Council's ancient hidden objective, filtered through Sorel's ruthless geometry. They weren't policing time. They were fighting a slow, desperate war against an unknown systemic instability, an entropy far worse than economic debt. Protocol 77.3 was designed to force a controlled localized temporal breach to lure the instability, the breach echo, out of the deep void and into a contained, regulated area. And the contained, regulated area was the archival matrix. Talus was the bait, and the Icarus crew were the breadcrumbs, their temporally fractured lives acting as highly resonant attractors. Sorrel hadn't been lying when she called him the ideal lure. He was the perfect, highly optimized trap. His punishment wasn't detention, it was the final fatal step of the protocol. Talus felt the archival matrix, his crushing cage, begin to heat up, humming with the power drawn from the chronometer core where Reese was trapped. The system was reaching critical mass. Sorrel intended to use the amplified energy resonance, combined with Talus's unique temporal field, to create a final focused implosion, a localized black hole event that would permanently sever the breach echo from the timeline, protecting the galactic core at the cost of the entire central hub and everyone currently inside, including the Icarus crew. A cold, crisp laugh echoed over the loudspeaker. Closer now, real, physical. Do you see it now, architect? Sorrel's voice, triumphantly live, was clear against the deafening static. The stability of history outweighs the survival of any single entity. This is the ultimate application of the Covenant. Your life, and the lives of your 300 liabilities, secures the continuum. Talus's vision, still swimming in red emergency light, focused on the dark smudge Javen had left on the floor. Javen died trying to fix a machine Talus knowingly broke. Talus himself was just a highly advanced tool, about to be scrapped for the greater good. His father, the logistics captain who died upholding the rules, would have been proud of the calculation if not the human cost. The surge of understanding brought with it the impossible choice. He could comply. He could accept his fate as the ultimate sacrifice. If he allowed the containment protocol to finish, the hub would implode, the crew would perish, and the breach echo would be neutralized, saving billions in the core sectors and preserving the chronological covenant. He would die the ultimate hero, even if the history books recorded him as the worst terrorist. The cosmic debt would be paid. Or he could fight. He could use the amplified temporal resonance flowing through his body, the very energy Sorrel was using to kill him, to shatter the containment protocol entirely. He could force the power in the matrix to reverse flow, flooding the chronometer core in Sector 4 with raw, uncontrolled temporal energy. This would free Reese and the crew, destabilizing Sorrel's forces and giving the Icarus survivors a fighting chance. But the cost was immediate, devastating, and far-reaching. Releasing the breach echo from containment meant unleashing it fully upon the sector's main temporal regulator. It would not just destabilize the timeline, it would fracture it irreparably, leading to localized historical collapse, potentially erasing entire colonies from existence. Life over law. Talus had whispered 5 years ago. Now, the choice was local life over all history. If he died now, 300 people were lost, but the cosmos was safe. If he fought, 300 might live, but the universe might shatter. He was trapped between the cold, mathematical genocide of the Covenant and the anarchic, unpredictable destruction of the Void. Talus stared into the agonizing darkness. He saw his own hands, still free of the cuffs, pressed against the carbonite chair. They were the hands that signed the code Icarus 734 Maz to Javen, the code that killed the technician and amplified the threat. He realized that every single decision he had made since the crisis, the saving of the crew, the bypass, the hack in the matrix, the desperate plea to Javen, had been a predictable step in Sorrel's protocol, leading him precisely here. He was the perfect example of human hubris, manipulated by his own moral code. He looked at his hands and knew the truth that cut deeper than any physical pain. He didn't save the Icarus crew out of sheer altruism. He saved them because the thought of failing, of losing 300 lives like his father failed during the famine, was unbearable. He saved them to validate himself. He was selfish, and now he had to choose based on that selfishness. If he complied, Sorrel won. The idea of validating the system that had manufactured his trauma, that used his own crew as pawns, that killed Javen, The very system that had orchestrated the near death of the Icarus was the ultimate moral surrender. No. Obedience is negligence. He would not give them the satisfaction of dying compliant. Talus inhaled, a shallow, desperate gulp against the crushing pressure. He focused on the echo's frequency, the agonizing rhythm now flowing through his spine. He wasn't going to break the system. He was going to hijack the protocol and reverse the flow. He poured every ounce of latent quantum energy, every piece of knowledge he possessed about non-linear mechanics, into the resonant feedback loop. He was performing a full self-inflicted neural override on the largest temporal conduit in the sector. It was an act of suicidal violence against his own consciousness. The pressure intensified instantly, crushing, agonizing. Talus felt his blood vessels rupture under the inertial field. He forced the raw energy of the chronometer core to surge, backward, away from the central implosion point Sorel desired, toward the point of maximum resonance, the screaming drone, and the archival chamber door. A white-hot spike tore through his skull. He screamed soundlessly against the pressure. His eyes rolled back, registering only the blinding explosive discharge of pure non-temporal energy. The inertial dampening field instantly collapsed, fried by the feedback. Talus fell forward, free of the chair, landing hard on the sin-steel floor, coughing wetly, his body momentarily released from the weight of a dying star. He had won. He had broken the containment. The archival chamber was now silent, the klaxons dead, the emergency lights extinguished. The screaming drone was a molten pile of slag. The only sound was the wet rattle of Talus's own breathing and the sudden vast cold silence. But the cost hit him immediately. The energy discharge, designed to neutralize the containment, had ripped away something vital inside him. The intimate connection to time, the sixth sense that allowed him to see the lines bend, was gone, replaced by a dizzying, sickening vertigo. He was physically present, but temporally deaf, lost in the new silence. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, tasting blood and ozone. He had saved the crew's chance for freedom, but he had lost his ability to navigate the consequences. Through the shattered remnants of the archival chamber door, Regulator Sorel finally stepped into the room. She was unharmed, dressed impeccably, her expression one of cold, clinical fury. She held a disruptor pistol, aimed steadily at Talus's head. "You chose chaos, Architect," Sorel stated, her voice calm, utterly devoid of fear. "You could have bought us safety. Instead, you bought us a temporal recession." Talus simply tried to breathe, preparing for the shot. Then, Sorel looked past him, her eyes widening, just a millimeter, a tiny flicker of genuine, unprogrammed terror. Talus, temporally deafened, could only use his eyes. He looked where Sorel looked. The massive energy pulse Talus had released to shatter the containment hadn't just freed the breach echo. It had created a massive, chaotic energy wake that rippled through the sector's vulnerable chronology, through the shattered archival chamber, descending slowly through the void where the hallway used to be. Talus saw the answer to his 5 years of silence. The breach echo wasn't a monster. It was a fragment, and the massive energy burst had drawn the rest of it, the whole. He saw the structure, an impossible shape of twisted light and darkness, vast beyond comprehension, radiating a cold so deep it seemed to absorb all sound. It wasn't organic. It was a massive, impossibly advanced mechanism, a colossal, silent engine of history itself. And sitting right at the center of that engine, perfectly preserved, locked in a temporal stasis field, was the Icarus. Not the ship they returned in, but the original vessel, the one that should have been destroyed in the accretion disk 5 years ago. The horror wasn't the monster that followed them home. The horror was that nothing had followed them home. Talus hadn't saved the crew in the past. Protocol 77-3 had used his genius to create a copy, a parallel Icarus and a duplicate crew, sending them 5 years into the future as decoys to lure the Echo. The true Icarus, the real crew, including pilot Reese, had been captured by this colossal mechanism at the moment of the tear, frozen in time, waiting to be processed. Talus hadn't saved anyone. He had helped Sorel create 300 expendable ghosts. Sorel lowered her disruptor, her face pale. You didn't just break the system, Talus. You made the engine notice us. Talus tried to speak, but the words caught. He had betrayed the entire galaxy for the sake of 300 people who, in the cruelest sense of time, didn't even exist. He had doomed the entire sector for a counterfeit loyalty. His critical error was complete. He had spent all his power to save decoys, and in doing so, he had led the true predator directly to its original prey, and to the man who built the timeline, Aryan Talus. Before we proceed, log your entry. Which country or planet are you watching from right now? The commander is tracking every active signal. The cold, absolute clarity that followed the explosion was worse than any pain. Failure had a geometry, and Aryan Talus was at its precise center. He hadn't saved anyone. He had simply served as the highly volatile key to open a door he should have kept sealed. He had traded 5 years of economic stability for the erasure of 300 souls. Regulator Sorel did not shoot him. She stood amidst the wreckage of the archival chamber, her eyes fixed on the colossal, silent engine visible through the shattered doorway, but her mind was calculating the immediate aftermath. "Secure the asset," she commanded into her wrist communicator, her voice now tight with professional urgency, the earlier note of triumph erased by existential fear. Neural integrity required, minimum stabilization only. Talus felt hands, or rather manipulator arms, lift his broken body from the floor. He was temporally deaf, lost in a sickening, persistent vertigo. The ambient air was thick with the scent of burnt synth steel and, underneath it, a sterile chemical sweetness, the smell of the central hub's high-containment medical stabilizers. He was moved into an adjacent secondary containment room, a cube of polished white plasteel. They didn't bother with the matrix chair this time. Instead, 2 medical drones strapped him onto a standard gurney, immediately applying high-frequency neural stabilizers to his temples. The low, constant hum of the stabilizers pressed against his consciousness, attempting to rebuild the temporal coherence he had deliberately shattered. His hands, still trembling from the energy discharge, were secured above his head. He looked down his chest, focusing on the slight rise and fall of his breath, the only proof of his continued existence. Sorel appeared in the doorway, framed by 2 armed enforcers. She held a data pad, reviewing the fallout of his desperate act. "The engine is static," Sorel reported, not to him, but to an unseen high-level council member via secure comms. "It has stabilized its acquisition vector. The decoy field is holding, but its chronal signature is degrading rapidly. We have 22 standard hours before the 300 decoys collapse into temporal dust. 22 hours to complete the final protocol, Architect." Talus tried to speak. He tried to warn her that the engine was here for data, not just the original Icarus, but his throat worked against him, constricted by pain and exhaustion. Sorel finally looked at him, her gaze clinical and unwavering. "Your sabotage did not free the crew, Talus. It simply activated the engine's secondary function, processing the originals. You wasted our containment time, and you caused the death of Technician Javen. You are now solely responsible for providing the counter-algorithm to stabilize the temporal fracture you created." She walked closer, stopping beside the gurney. "The true cost of your life-saving hubris is this. You must now use what remains of your genius to preserve the continuum, even if it means watching your decoys fade and knowing the originals are lost. You are compliant, Architect, or we allow the engine to consume the entire sector. Your choice." The pressure in the small room was intense. Talus had always believed in the utility calculus, the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, the choice was between 300 non-existent lives, the decoys, 300 frozen lives, the originals, and the stable existence of billions. The math of horror was simple. He looked away, focusing on the ceiling where the white light was almost offensively bright. The shame was a physical weight, heavier than the inertial field had ever been. He didn't save the Icarus crew out of altruism. He saved them because his ego, forged in the trauma of his father's failure, could not tolerate the thought of loss. He had sought validation through a chaotic act of heroism, and that chaos had now brought down the silent, colossal mechanism designed to police the very history he cherished. "I am not a hero trying to save the world," Talus thought, the realization crushing the last remnants of his self-respect. I am a coward running from the ghost of my father's failure. And in my attempt to prove myself right, I have condemned everyone. He felt the cold, hard press of his own desperation. He was finished, broken, temporarily deaf. What was left? Only the capacity for calculation, divorced from intuition. Sorrel, sensing his internal collapse, pressed her advantage. She stepped aside, revealing a small holographic projection on the wall opposite him. It was pilot Kellen Reese. But not the Reese Tallis knew, the vigorous, worried pilot of the decoy Icarus. This Reese was seated in a containment field, visibly convulsing. The images were real-time, sourced from the chronometer core. His face was waxen, his eyes wide and unfocused, but his body was actively resonating with an alarming, high-frequency temporal energy. Pilot Reese is one of the decoys, Sorrel stated, her voice flat. His personal timeline fracture, the 5 years lost, made him the strongest attractor. When you shattered the containment, you flooded his unstable temporal signature with raw chronal energy. He is now decaying rapidly, burning through his remaining physical structure to attract the engine. Watch. On the projection, Reese's containment field began to dim, flickering erratically. A deep, wet cough racked his body. He opened his mouth, trying to scream, but only a sharp tearing sound emerged, a sound that even without his temporal sense, Tallis registered as excruciating dissonance. You have 22 hours until he completely phases out of existence, Tallis. And when Reese goes, the decoy field collapses, and the engine will turn its attention directly to the hub's main chronometer. We need the counter algorithm now. Sorrel placed the datapad on the gurney beside his shoulder, within painful reach. The screen displayed the core parameters of the engine's current position and the fluctuating energy readings of Reese. It was an obscene offering, a clean slate, a chance to redeem himself by sacrificing everything he held dear. He could work, die a compliant hero, and save the continuum. He looked at Reese's agony, a living testament to his catastrophic failure. He felt the pull toward surrender, the sweet relief of letting the archival matrix finally claim him, silencing the guilt forever. It would be easier just to stop, to be silent, to be archived. He closed his eyes. He had nothing left. No allies, no temporal sense, no belief in his actions. Is that your decision, Architect? Sorrel asked, her voice laced with finality. Compliance, or do we allow Reese to die now and use your corpse as a final, non-compliant sacrifice? Tallis opened his eyes. He reached for the datapad, his fingers stiff and clumsy. He began to input the diagnostic sequence, acknowledging the cold, hard logic of the Covenant. He was the tool. He would perform the function. He would save the billions and condemn the 300, including the innocent ghosts he had created. He worked for 3 hours. The hum of the neural stabilizers was a constant, irritating pressure. His vision blurred repeatedly, forcing him to wipe the cold sweat from his eyes. His calculations flowed quickly, perfectly. The genius was still there, a cruel, precise instrument detached from his ravaged humanity. As he finished the primary stabilization sequence, designed to buy Sorrel another 3 hours, he scrolled through the raw diagnostic logs of the engine, the vast, captured mechanism visible through the external monitors. Sorrel had left the full data stream open, confident he would only focus on the counter-algorithm. And then, amid the millions of lines of complex temporal geometry, something flashed, a subroutine notation he had not seen before, hidden deep beneath the proprietary chronal buffer code. It was a faint, almost subliminal flicker in the engine's stasis field signature. A temporal oscillation, a minor systemic instability. This was not a flaw in the engine's structure, but a byproduct of the Icarus original crew's capture. The engine was holding the originals too tightly, trying to stabilize their chronal signatures before processing. The oscillation represented less than 0.1% deviation. Insignificant in galactic physics, catastrophic to a navigational architect. And then Tallis saw the true horror of Sorrel's mistake. She had given him too much data, The oscillation was centered precisely on the stasis field, holding Captain Alara Kane, the most temporally stable of the original crew. Tallis realized his final, terrible, self-serving option. He could not fight the engine, but he might be able to leverage its flaw. If he could flood that precise oscillation point with a concentrated burst of chronal feedback, it wouldn't free the original Icarus. It would temporarily destabilize the engine's core focusing array, forcing it to release its hold on the chronometer core and the dying decoy, Reese. Reese would be saved, the decoy field would temporarily stabilize, and Sorel would gain a few hours of false safety. But the action would require a connection, a physical, neural connection to the hub's raw power conduit, bypassing the stabilizers. The act would not only sever his last neural stabilizers, but would burn out every remaining trace of his temporal sense, leaving him permanently damaged, possibly vegetative. It was the ultimate sacrifice of self for the sake of autonomy. He wouldn't save the world, but he could choose to die on his own terms, freeing the decoys who represented the last piece of his flawed loyalty. He looked at the datapad, then at Reese's convulsing image, then at Sorel, still studying her comms, oblivious. Tallis, ignoring the throbbing pain and the vertigo, began manipulating the primary neural stabilizer connections at his temples. He forced the raw energy flow into a localized feedback loop, preparing to overload the hub's nearby auxiliary power relay. The gamble was absolute: death or permanent neural collapse. But in the pit of his defeat, there was a tiny, fierce spark of resistance. He would not be Sorel's tool. He ripped the stabilizers from his head. The resulting spike of pain was blinding, a flash of white-hot agony that ripped through his consciousness. "Architect, what are you doing?" Sorel screamed, finally noticing the movement, reaching for her disruptor. Tallis ignored her. He forced his body to move, pushing himself off the gurney, falling to his knees beside the auxiliary power conduit running along the floor. He used the last of his strength, grabbing the exposed, humming coil. The energy surged instantly into his body. His hands tightened around the coil, his muscles locking in a painful spasm. He focused the raw power, not on the main archive, but on the precise, calculated frequency of Kane's chronal oscillation. He screamed, a genuine raw sound this time, as the surge ripped through his nerves. He felt his mind tearing, his consciousness unraveling. The last thing he registered was the sound of Regulator Sorel firing her disruptor, and the blinding realization that the energy feedback was not just flowing into the engine's oscillation point, but was actively transmitting the precise, complex calculation that created Protocol 77. 3. The secret of the decoy field. Out into the sector. He had saved Reese, but he had just broadcast Sorel's most crucial secret to everyone listening, and someone was listening. A sudden sharp burst of static crackled across the abandoned comms panel in the room. It was not the engine. It was a secure military frequency, the highest encrypted code. A voice, familiar and deadly, cut through the white noise. Signal received. Protocol 773 confirmed. Prepare the fleet. We are going to war with the engine, and we are coming for the architect. The disruptor bolt from Regulator Sorel's pistol hit the auxiliary power conduit with a sharp crack, missing Tallis's body by inches, but the resulting surge of feedback completed the circuit Tallis had initiated. The raw energy, flowing from the conduit through his convulsing body, momentarily created a quantum shield, deflecting Sorel's charge into the wall. The white light of the blast was instantaneous, followed by the deafening roar of the security system collapsing. The immediate chaos, the sound of Sorel's shout, the hiss of melting metal, the abrupt cessation of the neural stabilizers, was instantly replaced by a deep, unnatural silence in Tallis's ravaged mind. The temporal vertigo peaked, sickening and absolute. He was temporally deaf, blind to the echoes, yet keenly aware that he had just accomplished two things simultaneously: stabilizing Reese's decay and broadcasting the existence of Protocol 77. 3. To every listening post in the sector. The high-encrypted military signal, which had acknowledged the receipt of the data packet, cut off instantly, leaving only the sound of sizzling metal and Tallis's ragged, wet breathing. Talus, his legs useless, pushed himself backward along the floor, using his right elbow for leverage. He was an animal, not an architect, driven by pure instinctual survival and the brutal geometry of his current environment. His left arm hung limp, having absorbed the residual discharge from the conduit blast. Regulator Sorel, surprisingly composed, stepped over the smoldering debris of the power relay. She ignored the black scorch marks on the plasteel and aimed the disruptor at Talus's head. "You chose defiance over logic, architect. A predictable but profoundly inefficient outcome," Sorel stated, her voice returning to its measured clinical pitch. She did not raise her voice. She merely quantified the disappointment. "The fleet you just summoned cannot fight the engine. They lack the localized chronal synchronization required. They will accelerate the crisis, not resolve it. You have merely exchanged a surgical sacrifice for sector-wide contamination." Talus tried to speak, but only a sharp, ragged cough escaped. The pain was irrelevant. Sorel's cold logic was what truly hurt. She is right. He knew the military fleets operated on standard chronal parameters. Engaging the engine without localized dilation capabilities would be like throwing dust at a singularity. But Talus didn't need them to win. He needed them to create chaos. "The broadcast was an act of terrorism, Talus," Sorel continued, advancing slowly. "And for that, you will be terminated and your neural structure archived before the military jump stabilizes. I will not allow your chaos to infect the tactical response." Talus realized Sorel's tactical objective had shifted from containment to data deletion. She had to ensure the military, or any other competing power structure, did not gain access to the engine's exact location or the specifics of Protocol 77. 3. The secret to creating decoy crews. Sorel raised the disruptor, the muzzle glowing a fierce charged blue. Talus, driven by a new focused desperation, kicked out with his right leg, not at Sorel, but at the medical gurney he had just left. The gurney, now unsecured, slid across the polished floor, striking Sorel's legs and momentarily throwing off her aim. The disruptor fired, a blast of energy that vaporized a square foot of wall where Talus's head had been moments before. He used the momentary distraction, scrambling toward the main security override console an arm's length away. His mind, though temporally deafened, was mapping the hub's internal structure based on the current system failures. The power surge he caused earlier had compromised the hub's kinetic dampers. If he could overload the primary stabilization matrix, the entire central hub would be vulnerable to the physical intrusion of the incoming fleet. He reached the console and slammed his good hand onto the interface. His fingers, still trembling from the residual quantum vibration, moved with agonizing precision across the light panel. He was no longer trying to solve a puzzle. He was trying to break the machine. Sorel recovered instantly. She didn't waste another shot. She dropped the disruptor, understanding that a kinetic weapon was too volatile in the compromised hub. Instead, she grabbed a heavy, polished fire extinguisher casing from the wall, a purely analog weapon, and advanced on Talus. "You cannot fight the law, Talus. It is fundamental," she hissed, swinging the heavy metallic cylinder low. Talus blocked the blow with his left arm, the damaged one, hearing the sickening crunch of impact. The pain was blinding, white-hot, but it didn't slow the calculation streaming through his consciousness. The Covenant dictates the stability of history outweighs the survival of any single entity. Sorel was acting on immutable principle. He used the impact to throw himself upward, turning his shattered left arm into a lever. He drove his right elbow hard into Sorel's sternum. It was not a trained military strike. It was the wild, exhausted flail of a desperate man. Sorel gasped, staggering back, dropping the canister with a metallic clang. Talus didn't follow up. He had secured the 4 seconds he needed. He slammed his right hand onto the console, initiating the override sequence. Destabilize core kinetic dampers. Target, sector entry points. The console screamed, not an alarm, but a data overload. The holographic projection of Kellen Reese flickered violently and winked out, replaced by a warning. Core structural integrity, 37%. "Idiot!" Sorel yelled, her composure finally breaking. a raw, primal sound of fury replacing the measured tone. "You are collapsing the containment shell. The engine will take the chronometer core." Talus felt a surge of cold, absolute calm flood his veins, a chilling acceptance of the cost. He looked at Sorel, bruised and raging. "I know the cost," Talus managed, his voice a raw whisper, spitting blood onto the plasteel floor. His failure was his greatest strength now. He had proven he was willing to condemn the entire sector if it meant dismantling Sorel's control. He was operating on a moral principle Sorel could not predict: complete, self-destructive recklessness. Sorel understood the change instantly. A man who valued nothing, not safety, not law, not even his own life, was an uncontrollable variable. She abandoned the fight for the console, pivoting with the efficiency of a high-level predator. She grabbed her disruptor from the floor, but didn't aim at Talus. Instead, she pointed it at the main chronometer core access panel. "I will not allow your treason to destroy the stability of the core sectors," Sorel decreed, her face set in a mask of final, unshakable resolution. "I initiated Protocol 77-3 to protect history. I will now sacrifice the hub to protect the data. The only way to stop the engine from acquiring the chronometer core is to implode it." Talus's eyes widened. Sorel was willing to activate the complete, irreversible self-destruct sequence for the central hub, killing herself, Talus, and potentially every surviving decoy crew member, to deny the engine the chronometer core data, and to deny the incoming fleet the operational advantage of the hub. Sorel began inputting the override code on the chronometer panel. Her fingers were fast, practiced. Talus knew the sequence by heart. He had designed half of it. It would take 10 seconds. Talus, his left arm hanging uselessly, surged forward with his right arm, not to stop her, but to complete his own objective. He reached the now compromised security console, and using the final 2 seconds before Sorel's sequence locked him out, he forced the targeting beacon, the precise location of the engine and the original Icarus, through the military burst transmission channel. He didn't know who received the data, but the fleet was aiming for the hub. Now, they would be aiming for the engine. Sorel hit the final command. The central hub did not explode immediately. Instead, a piercing, single-frequency alarm cut through the chaos. Chronometer core stabilization override. Catastrophic implosion sequence initiated. Time to detonation, 90 seconds. Sorel looked up from the panel, her eyes locking onto Talus's. She didn't look defeated, only resigned. "You won the local battle, Architect," Sorel said, slowly retrieving the fire extinguisher canister from the floor. She walked toward a small, secondary hatch marked Containment Transfer. "You chose life over law, again and again, but the law endures." She paused at the hatch, which Talus recognized as the entrance to a high-pressure, radiation-shielded secondary containment cube, a tomb designed for storing hazardous material. "I killed Javen. You killed 37 support staff in the chaos, and now, we will both die for the Continuum," Sorel stated, her voice returning to its calm reportorial quality. "Difference is, I was acting under sanctioned protocol. You were acting on hubris." Talus slid the last few feet, reaching the containment transfer hatch just as Sorel slammed the door shut from the inside. The heavy sin steel hissed, sealing her within the secure cube. She was sacrificing her physical self for the preservation of her data and her philosophy, ready to observe the final 90 seconds in safety before the inevitable implosion. Talus hit the release panel for the outer cube door, hammering at the controls, needing to confront her, to force her to see the human cost. He only needed 3 seconds to override the locking mechanism, but Sorel had calculated for his last act. As the outer door hissed open, allowing Talus to glimpse Sorel standing calmly inside the sealed inner chamber, a hidden sensor registered Talus's damaged neural signature. Sorel, still looking perfectly calm, spoke into a microphone inside the cube. "Final protocol execution. Asset 6 containment seal." A heavy kinetic blast door slammed down between Talus and the outside corridor, sealing him into the cramped space between the sealed containment cube, where Sorel stood, and the outer blast door, now locking him in. He was trapped in the transfer chamber, a metallic box barely larger than himself. Sorrel watched him through the thick shielded viewport. The law requires a witness to the debt. Architect, enjoy your final 70 seconds. Talus pounded on the outer door, realizing the final sickening complexity of her maneuver. Sorrel was protected inside the cube. Talus was trapped outside it, in the transfer chamber. When the central hub imploded in 70 seconds, the primary blast would incinerate Talus, but the containment cube would likely survive the worst of the energy shockwave, leaving Sorrel alive. The sole survivor, witness to his death, and ready to report on the tactical situation to the incoming fleet, blaming the entire disaster on the temporal terrorist Aryan Talus. He had won the moral ground and exposed the protocol, but Sorrel had secured the final narrative and ensured his ultimate demise. Talus leaned his head against the cold, unyielding blast door. The alarm timer counted down. T58 seconds. He was temporally deaf, physically broken, sealed inside a metal box with a vindictive bureaucrat on the other side of a thick viewport, waiting for him to vaporize. He had risked everything for a flawed loyalty to ghosts. He had sacrificed his genius for chaos. In the midst of the roaring internal silence, Talus finally understood the cold, crushing truth of the universe. He was not a hero. He was a force of entropy, a man whose obsession with saving life always resulted in a proportional increase in destruction elsewhere. He had traded a contained disaster for universal chaos, and his reward was this cold box. He closed his eyes and accepted the full weight of his failure. It was absolute. And in that absolute, horrifying certainty, Talus felt a strange, quiet peace. He had failed spectacularly, yes, but he had failed on his own terms. He had refused to be their tool. T40 seconds. Talus opened his eyes, staring through the viewport at Sorrel. She looked back, waiting for his final plea or scream. Instead, Talus raised his right hand, the only one that still functioned, and pressed it against the thick plasteel barrier separating them. He didn't speak. He smiled, a thin, terrible curve of the lips, devoid of humor, rich only in dark knowledge. Sorrel flinched, recognizing the look. It was the absolute, unyielding calm of a man who had faced the true cost and accepted it. T25 seconds. Then, the floor beneath Talus vibrated violently. It wasn't the hub implosion, it was external. A massive, localized temporal distortion signature, the sound of a fleet making an unsanctioned high-velocity jump directly into the sector. Sorrel's eyes widened, genuinely terrified now. The fleet was here far too quickly. Talus's beacon had been too effective. A new deafening alarm blared. External jump signature detected. Unidentified vessel. Temporal displacement. Minimal. Vessel name. Talus's ghost. Talus recognized the code name instantly. It wasn't a military fleet. It was a high-level covert operations vessel, a black ops team, potentially run by the very people Sorrel had fought to protect, or a rival faction. They weren't here to save the Continuum. They were here to acquire the Engine and Protocol 77. 3 data that Talus had just broadcast. The hub was seconds from self-destructing, and an unknown hostile force had just arrived, using Talus's own decoy signature as an entry point. T10 seconds. The containment cube shuddered violently as the external blast door, the one separating Talus from the corridor, was breached by an external kinetic charge. The door warped inward with a shrieking sound of metal tearing, and a plume of hot, pressurized air rushed into the transfer chamber. Through the torn wreckage of the blast door, a figure in heavy, midnight black combat armor stepped through the smoke, their visor glowing a cold, clinical red. The figure ignored Sorrel, ignored the implosion countdown, and focused solely on Talus, trapped in the transfer chamber. "Aryan Talus," the armored figure said, their voice synthesized to a deep, resonant monotone. "The data was received. You are coming with us. The engine is our target. 3 seconds. Talus looked at the armored figure, then at Sorrel, still sealed in her cube, her face a mask of calculated fury. He had survived the collapse of time, the judgment of the Council, and his own self-destructive heroism. He had not secured a victory, only a reprieve. He was not free. He was simply changing captors. The figure in black armor extended a powerful, mechanized hand toward him. T1 second. The chamber shuddered violently, engulfed in light and the sound of tearing metal, but the predicted implosion did not occur. Talus was pulled forward into the grasp of the armored figure, the last thing he saw before blacking out being the look on Regulator Sorrell's face. A look of pure, unadulterated defeat, trapped in a cube designed for her survival. He had bought his life with the destruction of everything else, and the cost was just beginning to accrue. The central hub did not implode. Aryan Talus registered the cessation of the 90-second timer, not with relief, but with a deep, sickening lurch, the telltale signature of a localized high-energy temporal field being imposed over a volatile core. He was no longer in the transfer chamber. He woke to a cold, insistent humming that felt calculated, mechanical, and utterly impersonal. Ellipsis temporalis. 2 standard weeks had passed since the extraction. Talus was strapped to a synthetic gel medical platform aboard Talus's Ghost, the covert vessel that had plucked him from the edge of oblivion. The medical bay was utilitarian, painted in functional gray and stripped of any decoration, a stark contrast to the sterile, deceitful elegance of the Authority hub. His left arm was immobilized in a high-frequency bone stabilizer. The tremor in his hands was permanent, a constant quantum vibration that felt like internal static electricity. The temporal vertigo had subsided, replaced by a profound, agonizing internal silence. He was definitively temporally deaf. The lines of reality no longer bent for him. They were rigid, unforgiving walls. A figure stood over him, the leader of the extraction team. They were unmasked, revealing a face deeply scarred by plasma burns and framed by close-cropped white hair. Not Sorrell's geometry, but the brutal, functional symmetry of a career operative. She wore the rank insignia of a Sector 11 Black Fleet commander, a jurisdiction perpetually at war with the Chronological Covenant, known for prioritizing tactical advantage over systemic stability. "Welcome back, Architect," Commander Riven said, her voice a low, gravelly counterpoint to the humming machinery. "I am Commander Riven. Your data broadcast was effective. We successfully extracted the chronometer core, the engine, and the decoy vessel Icarus from the blast radius. Regulator Sorrell is now archived in her containment cube, awaiting review by the High Fleet Admiralty." Talus tried to sit up, a movement immediately curtailed by the restraints. "Reese, the decoys. Pilot Reese stabilized. The 300 decoys are currently intact, held by the temporary chronal anchor we secured from the hub. They are not alive, not exactly. They are sustained data. Ghosts with mass, still attracting the engine. Your efforts bought them, and us, exactly 37 hours. 37 hours. Talus had paid the price of his genius, his arm, his temporal sense, the death of Javen, and the collapse of the hub, for less than 2 days of reprieve. The truth hit him with the force of an actual kinetic blast. He was not a savior. He was merely a more effective catalyst for a rival power structure. "The engine," Talus rasped, his throat dry. "It is processing the original crew. We need to stop the processing, not contain it." Riven leaned closer, her expression unreadable. "We know. We brought you here to do precisely that. Your Protocol 77-3 was a brilliant defense mechanism, designed to survive a localized chronal tear. But the engine's core function is data acquisition. It's taking the original Icarus crew, because their temporal signatures contain the precise trauma data required to map a weakness in the universal chronology, the final code for galactic instability." She pressed a button on the wall. A holographic projection materialized above his gurney. The colossal, dark outline of the engine held fast in the Ghost's external stabilization field. Within its structure, the phantom image of the original Icarus glowed faintly. "We don't want to destroy the engine, Talus. We want to stabilize it and use its processing data. We need you to open the internal stasis field holding the original crew. We need Captain Kane's real navigation logs." Talus stared at the image of the engine. This was the final price. He had to accept his role as the necessary traitor. He was not a hero but a tool of entropy, forever choosing the local, devastating choice over the general, clean stability. He looked at Riven, his decision cold, immediate. I will not give you the engine's data, and I will not risk the originals becoming an acquisition tool for Sector 11. The cost is too high. Riven nodded slowly, not surprised. Then give us the means to destroy the engine entirely, an irreversible feedback loop. We will lose the data, but the decoys will stabilize, and the threat will be neutralized. Total erasure, a clean slate for the future. Talus closed his eyes. Total erasure. This was the final act of non-compliance. He had sacrificed the law for life, only to learn that the only true sacrifice was sacrificing the lives he treasured for the stability of the law, or in this case, the stability of nothing at all. He had created the ghosts. Now, he had to uncreate them, both the originals and the decoys. The engine's core focusing array. It responds to an inverse chronal burst focused on its internal acquisition mechanism, Talus said, his voice stronger now, calculating. But the burst must be amplified by a neural transfer, a direct synaptic burnout, feeding raw consciousness into the matrix. Riven's eyebrow lifted slightly. Suicide protocol, expected, and the cost. The cost, Talus murmured, looking down at his trembling, cuffless hands, is that the temporal rupture will be complete. All 300 decoys, the original 300, and the Icarus, all 600 signatures will collapse into irreversible non-existence. They will have never left the accretion disk. He realized the beautiful, terrible geometry of the ending. The Icarus crew would be spared the trauma of 5 lost years. The original crew would be spared the agony of being processed, and Regulator Sorrel's initial calculus would be fulfilled retroactively. The survival of the individuals was sacrificed for the stability of the continuum. He would finally achieve the perfect, terrible ending that the Covenant demanded, but on his own terms. I agree, Riven stated. You do the transfer. We will secure the stabilization field. Total erasure it is. The process was swift. Talus was moved to the Ghost's tactical bridge, a cramped space filled with humming, organic consoles. He was seated before the engine's projection, connected by thick neural cables. Riven and her team worked silently around him. He was momentarily brought into contact with the engine's core. It wasn't cold, it was vast and indifferent, a cosmic paper shredder performing a necessary function. He saw the originals, Captain Kane, Pilot Reese, frozen, their faces peaceful, unaware of the 5-year agony they had avoided. And he saw the decoys, faintly visible, the ghost crew he had loved and sacrificed. He focused his remaining neural energy, forcing the complex sequence through the fragile, damaged pathways of his mind. He didn't flinch. He embraced the destruction, the total cost. The blinding white light of the feedback loop was the final sensation. He heard no screaming, no alarms, just a brief, sharp whine, the sound of 300 lives twice over being torn from existence. Then, silence. When the light faded, the engine was gone. Not destroyed, but vanished, dissipated into the chronological void. The space where the vessel Icarus had existed was now a featureless void. The decoy signatures vanished from the sensor logs. Talus had done it. He was removed from the neural links, his body trembling uncontrollably, his mind blanked of all high-level chronal memory. He was alive, but the navigational architect, the man who dictated time, was dead. He was now just Aryan Talus, a severely damaged man with an obsessive mechanical mind, capable only of simple, linear tasks. Riven stood over him. It is done. The engine, the Icarus, the decoys, all erased. Chronological stability restored to baseline. And the cost? Talus asked, the words simple, slow. The cost is a sector war that will last a generation, now that Protocol 77.3 has been broadcast and the existence of the engine confirmed. But the universe is safe from this specific vulnerability. We survived. Riven paused. And you, Talus, you are now free. Talus was left alone on the bridge, staring out at the star field. Freedom. The authority was gone, the council was crippled, Sorel was archived, the crew was erased, and his genius was burned out. He had traded everything for a stable oblivion. He looked down at his hands, watching the tremor. He finally understood the philosophical debt he had accrued. His father died prioritizing law over life, and the shame of that failure had driven Talus to prioritize life over law, resulting in chaos. The true path, he realized, was not the calculation of utility, but the acceptance of finality. He had fought the ticking of the clock, and the clock had ultimately claimed everything. The air in the sterile bridge of Talus's ghost smelled faintly of ozone and synthetic cleanser, the sterile scent of a definitive ending. He was alive, exiled, and irrevocably diminished. The only sound was the low, persistent, focused hum of the Black Ops vessel's main reactor, pressing down on the air like physical weight. Arian Talus always knew that the line between genius and criminal was drawn by compliance logs. He had 27 seconds to stabilize the accretion disk pull, or lose the Icarus and all 300 souls aboard. He had bypassed the temporal safeties without flinching. He saved them then, choosing life over law, choosing the now over the later. He had argued for 5 years in silence and fought for 2 weeks in chaos. Now, only the low hum remained. He had won his moral argument, only to lose the people he fought for. He was free of chains, free of the council, free of the debt. He finally understood the true weight of time, that some moments, once gone, are not meant to be returned to. The chronometers had finally stopped ticking. This story is now part of the archive. Subscribe to help preserve future transmissions, and share this episode with someone who still believes in science fiction.